Montana Territory, September 1884, the train screeched into the dusty station at Stillwater, a lonely town barely carved from the wild hills and pine-covered ridges. Naomi Trenton stepped down from the passenger car, her gloved hands trembling as they clutched her carpet bag. Her heart beat fast not from the chill in the wind, but from the hope she had held onto for over a month. She scanned the line of waiting men, her eyes locking onto the one who matched the photograph folded neatly inside her coat pocket. He was tall, with a thick mustache and a polished brown coat. She straightened her spine and walked toward him with quiet dignity. "Mr. Dobbins." Her voice was soft but steady. The man looked her over slowly, his mouth tightening. "You're Naomi," she nodded. "Yes, Naomi Trenton. We've been writing since July." He exhaled hard, then shook his head. "You're not what I expected." Naomi blinked. I came just like you asked. You said, I did not think you'd be so plain," he cut in, his tone sharp. "You talked like you were delicate. I need someone who can work. You look like you would break." Her cheeks flushed. "I may not look like much, but I came all this way to be a wife. I can learn." He raised a hand. "You ain't what I want. I changed my mind." She stared at him, the words sinking in like a stone in deep water. Around her, people bustled, wagons creaked, voices rose in greeting, but Naomi stood still. Her life had just unraveled before her, thread by thread. "Go back to where you came from," he added, already turning away. The wind whipped her skirt as she stood stunned on the wooden platform. A station hand passed by with a stack of crates. No one looked at her twice. She turned slowly, her eyes stinging, not from the cold. That was when she heard a voice behind her, solid, warm. Is he a fool or just blind? She turned to see a man leaning against a post, a wide-brimmed hat shading his eyes. He was younger than the others around the station, maybe in his late 20s, with a strong jaw and sun-darkened skin. His shirt was dusted from the ride and a coiled rope hung from his saddle. "I what?" she managed. He stepped forward. "I watched the whole thing." "You came all this way and he tossed you like a sack of grain." Naomi swallowed, her pride fraying. "I suppose it is not the first time someone thought I was not enough." Well, he was wrong. The man held out a gloved hand. "Atlas Hale." She hesitated, then shook it. "Naomi Trenton." He nodded toward the bench by the water pump. "You need a place to sit and some water." She followed him in silence, sitting stiffly as he filled a tin cup and handed it to her. "I do not understand," she said after a moment. "He said he wanted someone gentle." "Someone kind." "Kind does not mean weak," Atlas said. "I saw you try to stay calm. That takes grit." She blinked at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. He sat beside her, not too close. "Where are you headed now?" "I have no idea." She looked down at her hands. "I sold everything I had to get here. I was raised in a house for orphan girls in St. Louis. No family, no money." Atlas looked at her for a long time. "I got a cabin 10 miles out, land of my own. I run cattle and keep to myself mostly." She turned toward him, unsure what he was offering. "I was not looking for a wife," he said, watching the dust swirl near the tracks. "But seeing you get tossed aside like that, it made me think maybe I should have been." Naomi's breath caught. "I do not mean to sound forward," he went on, "but if you still want what you came here for. Maybe you were never meant for him." He looked at her then, clear and steady. "Maybe you were meant for me all along." Naomi sat frozen, her heart pounding. "I would not offer if I did not mean it," he added. "You can say no, and I will still get you a place to stay in town tonight. But if you say yes, I will take you home with me." For a moment, all she could hear was the wind in the cottonwoods. His eyes did not waver. There was no pity in them, only quiet strength. She stood slowly. "If you are asking me to come with you, I will." He nodded once, stood, and held out his hand. She placed hers into it. They rode out of Stillwater just before sunset, with Naomi sitting behind him on his roan gelding, arms wrapped around his waist as the land stretched wide into the golden distance. Neither of them spoke much on the ride. But when he glanced back and saw her leaning her cheek against his shoulder, he let out a slow breath and smiled. He had not planned on love, but somehow it had found them both. The sun had dipped behind the pines by the time Atlas and Naomi reached his land. The trail curved through a wooded hollow before opening to a gentle rise where a modest cabin stood. its chimney trailing a ribbon of smoke into the cooling sky. A rail fence bordered the pasture where a pair of longhorns grazed, their silhouettes calm against the dusky light. Atlas dismounted first, tying the reins loosely to a hitch post. Naomi slid down after him, her skirts brushing the dry earth. Her legs ached from the ride, but she didn't mention it. Instead, she took in the cabin, a single-story structure with a sod roof, smoke-stained logs, and a narrow porch with a rocking chair leaned against the wall. "You built this yourself?" she asked, her voice quiet but curious. "Every beam," he said, pulling the saddle off the roan. "Took 2 winters to get it right." She stepped closer to the porch, brushing her fingers along the worn railing. "It smells like pine." "Used red fir for the joints," he replied, pausing to glance at her. "It holds better in the cold." She looked back at him, thoughtful. "You live alone out here?" "Mostly." He led the horse to the lean-to beside the barn. "My uncle lived here before me, but he passed 3 years ago. Since then, just me and the land." Naomi didn't follow him right away. She stared at the hills beyond, where the trees stretched like dark fingers toward the sky. The quiet felt heavier than the noise of town, but not unkind. Inside, the cabin was warm with the scent of cooked beans and old wood. A low fire burned in the hearth and light flickered across the plank floor. Atlas lit a lantern and set it on the table, then stood back awkwardly. "It ain't much," he said, "but it's dry and safe." She stepped inside, setting her bag down near the door. "It's more than I've had in a long time." He rubbed the back of his neck. "There's only 1 bed. I'll sleep in the barn until we figure things out." Naomi turned, lifting her chin. "You don't have to do that." His brow furrowed. "I don't aim to rush anything." "I know," she said. "But I didn't come this far to be treated like glass." He looked at her, then really looked, not like the man at the station weighing what she lacked, but like someone trying to understand what she carried inside. "I'll take the floor tonight," she said. "Tomorrow we'll talk more." "About what this will be?" He nodded once, quiet. After supper, bread and beans eaten in silence, except for the crackle of the fire, they cleared the table together. Naomi moved carefully, watching how he handled the dishes, how he dried the tin cup with the hem of his shirt without thinking twice. There was a steadiness to him, like the earth underfoot. As she laid out a quilt near the hearth, she asked, "You ever been married?" He shook his head. "Thought about it once, but I was younger then, didn't think I had enough to offer." "And now, I still don't have much," he said. "But I got land. I got hands that work, and I got enough sense to know when something good's been set in front of me." She tucked the quilt beneath her knees. "You don't even know me. I know you didn't cry when he shamed you. I know you rode 10 miles without complaint. And I know you're not afraid of silence." Naomi lay back, the firelight flickering across the beams above. "Silence can tell you more than words ever could." Atlas leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the flames. "I'll build you a garden," he said after a while. "Come spring." She closed her eyes, her voice barely audible. "I'd like that." The wind rustled the shutters. The night settled deep and wide around them, but inside the cabin, something small had begun to root, quiet and certain, like seed taking hold beneath snow. Neither of them said another word, but they both slept easier than they had in years. By late October, the first frost came. Naomi stood at the edge of the pasture, her shawl wrapped tight as smoke curled from the chimney behind her. A flock of starlings scattered over the hills, rising and falling like breath. She watched them, the coarse wool of her gloves damp from the morning's work. Atlas stepped out of the barn, brushing hay from his sleeves. "Ground's turning hard earlier than last year." She turned toward him. "The roof's holding up well, though. I checked the seams yesterday. It'll see us through." They walked back toward the cabin together, boots crunching over frozen grass. Inside, the wood stove gave off a steady heat. Naomi moved to the table where she'd laid out a basket of sewing. She'd been stitching a curtain for the single window in the loft, piecing it from a calico dress she'd brought from St. Louis. The hem had frayed on the ride out, but the fabric still held the scent of lavender sachet. Atlas watched her thread the needle. "You always sew by hand." "I never had a machine," she said. "Most girls at the home weren't taught more than mending. You taught yourself, needed something to do between chores. It kept my hands busy." He bent to stack more wood beside the stove. You work like someone who never expects a thing to last. She met his eyes. Because it usually didn't, he nodded, not asking more. In the days that followed, they settled into a rhythm. Atlas rode out before sunup to check fence lines and cattle. Naomi kept to the cabin, gathering kindling, boiling laundry over the fire, and learning the land inch by inch. She didn't speak much during the day, but she listened to the groan of old trees in the wind, to the hush of falling needles, to the way the horses blew steam from their nostrils in the chill. One afternoon, she stood behind the cabin, digging a narrow trench for runoff. Her hands were raw, the soil stiff with ice. When she paused to shake out her fingers, she heard footsteps behind her. "You don't need to do that," Atlas said. "I was going to widen that trench myself." "I wanted to," she said, brushing dirt from her skirt. "It drains toward the root cellar." "We'll lose the preserves if it floods again." His brow lifted slightly. "You've been down there?" "Yesterday. The apples are starting to rot on the lower shelf." He rested his hand on the shovel she'd left leaning against the tree. "Most women wouldn't bother checking." "I never had the kind of life where I could wait for someone else to notice." He studied her, then nodded once. "Come with me." They walked past the barn and toward the hillside. He led her to a narrow trail that twisted up through the trees. As they climbed, her breath came harder, but she kept pace without complaint. When they reached the top, the land opened wide golden plains stretching beneath a pale sky, a creek cutting silver through the valley far below. "I come up here when I need to think," he said. Naomi stepped closer to the edge. "It's quiet, too quiet for some. Not for me." He crouched near a boulder, brushing leaves aside. "My uncle buried his dog up here. That old mutt followed him through 2 states. He used to say this was where things felt most like home." She sat beside the stone. "Did you love him?" "My uncle? Yeah, he took me in when my father passed, taught me everything I know." She looked down at her hands. "I never had anyone like that." He turned toward her. "You do now." The wind stirred her hair, lifting it from her neck. She didn't speak right away, but her eyes didn't leave his. "I don't want to be something you feel sorry for," she said. "I don't." "Then what do you see when you look at me?" He didn't answer at once. He looked at her like he was measuring something, not her worth, but her truth. "I see a woman who's still standing," he said. "After everything." She looked away, her throat tight. "I see someone who doesn't know her own strength," he added. Her voice was quiet. "I don't know what to do with kindness like that." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "Just let it be." They sat in silence as a falcon circled overhead, sharp and sure against the pale sky. When they finally walked back down the trail, Naomi reached for his hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The first snow came in the night, silent and sure, blanketing the roof and softening the world outside. Naomi woke at dawn to the hush of it, the frost-etched window glowing blue in the early light. She sat up slowly from the bed, her place now, shared with Atlas since the evening she'd quietly said, "I'm ready if you are." And he'd nodded once before taking her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. She dressed in the stillness, wool stockings and a heavier skirt, and stepped out onto the porch. The snow reached the top of her boots, fresh and untrodden. The pasture lay quiet, the cattle still in the lower field where Atlas had led them the day before, knowing the storm was coming. The door creaked behind her. "You always wake before the sun?" Atlas asked, tying his coat beneath his chin. Naomi turned slightly, her breath curling white. "Only when something feels different." He stepped beside her, brushing snow from the railing. "You get dreams?" "Sometimes," she said. "Last night I dreamt of a room with no walls, just sky. I was standing alone, but I wasn't afraid." He nodded slowly. "Back when I was a boy, I used to dream about water, big rivers moving too fast to cross. I'd wake up soaked in sweat." "Do you still?" "No." "Not since you came." They stood quietly, watching the light shift over the trees. Then Naomi stepped down into the snow, her hem dragging through the drifts. "I want to see the creek," she said. "It'll be half frozen." "All the better." He followed her without a word, their steps slow and deliberate through the woods. The snow clung to the branches, softening the world to a kind of hush that felt sacred. When they reached the bank, the water ran beneath a skin of ice, dark and slow. Naomi crouched and touched the edge. "It's colder than I thought. You always go toward the cold." I go where I'm not expected. He crouched beside her. I never expected any of this. She looked sideways at him. Do you miss being alone? He didn't answer at once. Some days I miss the quiet. But then I remember it was hollow quiet, not the kind that's shared. She looked down at the water. I never knew how to be with someone, not like this. You learn fast. I had to. He shifted closer, boots crunching the crusted snow. I never wanted a wife out of pity, Naomi. I wanted someone who'd see what I've built and not look past it. She met his eyes. You never treated me like charity. I never could. They stayed by the creek until the sun crested the ridge, turning the ice to amber. When they walked back, Naomi's fingers were stiff, but her chest felt warmer than it had in days. Inside, she peeled off her gloves and began setting flour into a bowl. Without being asked, Atlas fetched the lard and the crock of sour milk. She moved with quiet deliberation, fingers dusted white. He watched her, leaning against the doorframe. You know, he said, I never celebrated anything after my uncle died. She looked up. Not even your own birthday. Didn't see the point. She met his gaze, thoughtful. When is it? Early December. She turned back to the dough, pressing it flat with steady hands. Then we'll mark it, even if it's just the two of us and a tin of molasses. He smiled faintly. What about you? When were you born? Spring, she said. Late April. I never had a cake. But one year a nurse gave me a ribbon. What color? Green, like new leaves. They didn't speak again until the biscuits were in the oven, and even then, the silence between them was easy. As the scent of baking filled the cabin, Atlas stepped behind her and rested his hand gently on her waist. She didn't flinch. You're not what I expected either, she said. He leaned close, voice low. Good or bad? She turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. Better? Later, they ate by the window, watching snow fall again in the distance. Neither of them spoke much, but each glance held something new, something settled. Outside, the wind stirred the branches, but the cabin held firm. Inside, two lives once separate, now woven, sat steady in the storm. The final thaw came slow that year. By late March, the snow had receded into the hollows and shadows, leaving behind a landscape patched with mud and promise. Naomi stood at the edge of the vegetable plot, boots sunk deep in the softened earth. She held a burlap sack of seed potatoes under one arm, a small trowel in the other. Her hair was tied back with a strip of old muslin, and the sun had just begun to show itself above the ridge behind the barn. Atlas approached from the ridge trail, the dogs trotting at his heels. You're out early, she crouched, pressing a thumb into the soil. The ground's warm enough now. If I wait, they'll sprout before they're buried. He set down the sack of fence staples he'd been carrying. You want help? No, she said, glancing up. But I wouldn't mind company. He crouched beside her without another word, watching as she sliced each potato in half with a careful hand, eyes sharp for the healthiest buds. You ever planted a full garden before? He asked. She shook her head. Only window box herbs back when I was working for a family in St. Louis. I watched the cook tend them every morning. You never told me you worked in a house. I didn't stay long. The mistress didn't like girls who asked questions. He ran his fingers through the dirt. What kind of questions? Why her son had bruises on his wrists, why the cook wasn't allowed to eat at the same table. Atlas didn't answer right away. You always notice things others try to ignore. I tried not to, but I couldn't help it. She pressed another halved potato into the soil. I used to think it made me a burden. Now I think maybe it means I'm just not built for silence. He leaned back on his heels. You're not a burden, you never were, she glanced at him. Even when I ask too much, you don't ask more than you give. They worked in quiet rhythm. By noon, half the row was planted, the burlap sack much lighter. Atlas fetched water from the creek and they drank beside the shed, legs stretched into the sun. I've been thinking, he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. About the far field, she tilted her head. What about it? It's too much for cattle, never grows decent grass, but if I fence it off, we could let it go to orchard. Naomi looked at him, surprised. You want fruit trees, he nodded. Apples, maybe plums, if we can trade for cuttings. Might take 5-6 years, but they'd hold. She smiled slowly. I'd like that. I could make preserves, dry the skins for vinegar. He leaned against the shed wall, watching her. You've changed this place. I haven't done anything special, she said. You've done everything different, he replied. It used to feel like something I was keeping alive because I didn't know what else to do. Now it feels like it's growing. She lowered her gaze, the warmth of his words settling into her ribs. That night, she lit the small oil lamp and sat at the table, writing in a narrow, cloth-bound book she'd started 2 months earlier. She didn't tell Atlas what she wrote. He never asked, but he watched the way her shoulders curved over the pages, the way her pencil moved slow and certain. I want to get married proper, he said, voice low but firm. She looked up, pencil still in hand. I know we've been living like man and wife, and that's enough for some, but I want to put it on paper. I want people to know you're mine and I'm yours. She set the pencil down and stood. I was waiting for you to say it. You were. I didn't want to push, but yes, he rose, stepping close. We can ride to the justice in town. I'll trim my beard. You can wear whatever you like. I have that blue dress I patched last week, she said. It's simple. But it's clean. He took her hands in his. It's more than enough. They were married 4 days later in a small, sunlit room behind the general store. The justice was an old man with a stiff collar and a kind voice. Naomi's hands didn't shake when she held Atlas's. When the paper was signed and the vows spoken, they stepped outside into the spring air, the town quiet except for a dog barking somewhere down the lane. No one threw rice or clapped. But Atlas pulled her close and kissed her slow, right there on the boardwalk, and Naomi closed her eyes. Knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be, they rode home in silence, but it was the kind of silence she'd learned to love full, not hollow. That evening, she stood barefoot in the doorway of their cabin, watching Atlas hang a cedar frame above the hearth. Inside it, he'd placed the marriage paper, pressed flat beneath glass. His hand lingered on the wall, steadying it. She stepped behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist. We've got a long stretch ahead, he said. I'm not afraid of the stretch, she answered. As long as it's with you. He turned and kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her mouth. When they lay down that night, no words passed between them, but their hands found each other easily. Years passed. The orchard took root by the 3rd spring. The trees grew slow but sure. Naomi kept a ledger of the garden yields, marking each row with neat handwriting. The cabin stayed small, but it held everything that mattered. When their daughter came born in the hush of a May dawn, Atlas wept without shame, holding her tiny hand in his calloused one. They named her Clara, after Naomi's favorite nurse from childhood. Naomi planted lavender outside the window, just beneath the sill. She taught Clara how to press pie crust, how to carry kindling, and how to listen when someone's quiet wasn't empty. Atlas built a cradle from pine, carving a small bird into the headboard. Sometimes, on clear nights, he'd lift Clara onto his shoulders and walk the ridge trail, pointing out hawks and stars. They never left the land. They didn't need to. Their love didn't shout. It didn't clamor. It lived in the way he filled her water basin before dawn, in the way she folded his shirts with the buttons fastened, in the way they always came back to each other at the end of the day. And when the orchard finally bore fruit, a single red apple on a crooked branch, Naomi plucked it, turned to Atlas and placed it in his hands. He took one bite, then offered her the rest. They shared it, leaning against the fence they'd built together, watching Clara chase chickens through the grass. The sun was warm, the sky was wide, and everything they needed was already theirs.